Okay, thanks, Simon, both for that introduction and for inviting me up here. So, yeah, I'm John Sturzake. I work at the University of Liverpool. Used to work here as an RA with Simon, prior to which I did my PhD on affordable rural housing, prior to which I worked with Peter as a planning policy officer in Alnwick. So I've got a bit of sort of northeast links. It's always very nice to come back. So Simon asked me to speak on self-governance, or self-governing, possibly, and neighbourhood planning. So what I've done is try to delve into the assumption inherent in neighbourhood planning that communities can and will self-govern to produce a neighbourhood plan. So that's what I'm going to do, sort of question that, look at some of the predictions for neighbourhood planning beforehand, some of which were sort of quite dire, and then look at some of the early evidence that we've got so far on that, and then potentially talk about some signs of change. So, sort of boiling it down, for me, there were two elements really to whether self-governance can work in terms of neighbourhood planning: power and capacity. So power, do neighbourhoods have sufficient space to be able to affect change, whether that's in terms of power being devolved down from higher tiers, or whether they just say, well, you know, sod that and get on with doing something, but have they actually got space to do something? And capacity, do neighbourhoods have sufficient capacity, ability to be able to take advantage of any opportunities available? And Peter's covered the sort of power angle quite well, so I'm focusing in this presentation on the capacity issue, though I will come back to power towards the end. So there was a lot written in the run-up to the Localism Act being enacted, the Localism Bill as well as being enacted, including this report, which is still available online. It was called Who is Ready for the Big Society? And they did a sort of wide-ranging literature review on what would motivate people to get involved in the big society or localism. And they looked at two aspects. They looked at participation, first of all, and a key factor being were there sufficient participants in the neighbourhood of different types, and those are the ones they came up with. And their view, their conclusion from the evidence was that those types of people were more likely in general to be white, relatively older, better educated, wealthier, richer, and middle class. And the other side of it was the work on social capital, and the work of what's his name, Putnam? David? Putnam? Robert Putnam, sorry. So I'm doing great violence to his work by very briefly summarising. So social capital, the concept is that it's links and connections within an area that help build sort of trust and capacity to do things, in very brief summary. And their suggestion was that, again, communities that had lots of social capital were more likely to feature people like that. And whether or not you agree with that is a different question, but that's what they thought. And then they looked at the proportion of the population in different areas currently engaged in voluntary work. And in basically affluent rural areas, that was as high as 35%, but that's obviously still quite low. And then deprived urban areas down to about 15%. So the late Professor Sir Peter Hall pithily summarised this as being the big society tent is going to be occupied largely by well-meaning, well-educated people living in nice places, mostly rural, with time on their hands, which I thought was quite a nice quote. I'm constantly using that one. And then Simon and Paul did some work a couple of years ago on neighbourhood forums, NFs, questioning whether they were representative in sort of democratic terms. And they talked about three different forms of representation. Descriptive, so do the people who are on neighbourhood forums resemble, look like, are they similar to the people who they're representing? Symbolic, so do those representatives have meaning for the people they're representing? So they said that low turnouts in referendums might suggest not. And substantive, so the extent to which representatives were serving the interests and preferences of the representative in what they were doing. So some question marks in advance about whether neighbourhood planning was likely to, well, not likely to work, but whether the communities that had the capacity to do neighbourhood planning were going to be sort of particular types, and whether they would be truly representative. So some of the initial findings in practice, over there, I think, co-author of this work with Gavin Parker at Reading. So they've done a big kind of survey published in the various forms of all of the groups that have started doing neighbourhood planning. And they found there was 27 months to get from the start to the referendum stage. So bringing in some of what Peter said, sometimes people can get basically bored and tired of that fairly lengthy process. But I guess interestingly, 91% of all the neighbourhood areas in England who are doing this are in parish, i.e. almost exclusively means rural areas, and the proportion of plans passing referendums similarly. And they looked at where the neighbourhood areas were in the IMD index of multiple deprivation quintiles. So half of the neighbourhood areas are in the upper two of those, only 23% in the lower two. So a bit of a predominance of wealthier areas there, and broadly speaking, in very general terms, rural areas tending to be wealthier than urban as well. So that's who's doing it. In terms of the sort of representativeness, the first 52 referendums, DCLG published this last year, 88% of people voting yes, which is a nice headline, but the turnout was down at 32%, which is arguably not as high as it could be. So there's some general findings, and then just delving into that in a bit more detail. The Upper Eden Neighbourhood Plan, which I've done a bit of work looking at, which was the first to be made, so the first to go through referendum and be adopted. They had a similar turnout, 34%, but the people involved in that made the point that was actually 15% higher than the police and crime commissioner election that they'd had in that region a few years before. And it's not a terribly low proportion in terms of local elections and so on. So it may be 34% isn't bad in that context. They had only 31 responses to the draft neighbourhood plan, and that was from a population of about 5,000. But again, when I kind of looked into it, I looked at how many responses had they had to the local plan consultation in that district the year or two before, and there were only 72 to that from a population 10 times larger. So you could argue there's actually more engagement in neighbourhood planning than local planning on that, well, quite a lot more on that measure. So that neighbourhood plan was produced by a locally resident planner. He was initially unpaid as chair of the group, and then paid to produce the plan via the front runner money from the government. And planners have often been prominent in other examples of particularly the early neighbourhood plans. Peter obviously being one example. Alan Dale at Jeff Ive has done some work on, and various others that I'm aware of around the country. So all that suggests then that the capacity to do neighbourhood plans possibly does, certainly the evidence largely rest in wealthier areas, and even in such areas planners are often dominant in the process, which doesn't really fit with what the government said at the outset. This was supposed to be, as Peter said, light touch, and Andrew Sturnell, who was Minister for the Big Society or something, I think said at one stage, planning shouldn't be brain surgery, sort of implying that anybody should be able to get on and do it, which, having trained as a planner, was mildly galling, but nonetheless, what they hope for and what seems to have happened doesn't necessarily seem to have matched up. But possibly we're now seeing some change, and I just want to talk in a little bit of detail to finish with some areas I'm particularly familiar with in Merseyside, where I now live and work. So Wirral Borough Council, which is across the River Mersey from Liverpool, was very active initially. Communities within it were very active in neighbourhood planning. They have 4 of the front runners, which were piloting the process. And Wirral, for those who probably don't know it, is sort of split down the middle. The west side, very leafy, green, affluent. The east side, not so much. And these 4 front runners, Hoylake and Greasby are on the west. Devonshire Park is on the east, but it's reasonably wealthy area. And then Central Liskeard was something of an anomaly. It had an extremely active local man who was running that. So they started off very active on the Wirral. 2 of those neighbourhood plans have now been abandoned. Devonshire Park has gone through the process and been made, and Hoylake, the Examiner's report, has just published. So 50% of the initial activity is basically dried up. They've now got another couple of areas have come on stream. Leasowe, again on the leafy west, Birkenhead and Tranmere on the very much not leafy east, one of the more deprived parts of the borough. So things are starting to change on the Wirral, and Liverpool is an interesting contrast. So they only had one front runner, which was the Innovation Park, which is a sort of industrial estate, and that was a business-led neighbourhood plan. That was the only one that there was in Liverpool. The City Council was not publicly but privately very opposed to neighbourhood planning. They considered it to be a Tory plot, in their words. It's very obviously Labour-dominated area, so they were not keen on it at all. So they did not encourage communities to do it. But nevertheless, there are now 5 areas doing neighbourhood planning in Liverpool. This seems to have gone to sleep. Looking at their website, nothing much has happened for a couple of years. But these 4 have all started activity in the last few years, and none of those really could be described as, in Peter's terms, sort of well-heeled areas concerned about property investment. There seems to be something else motivating them. And this map, which is from the Liverpool City Council website, shows where they are. And the interesting thing for me, who lives in Liverpool, is where they are. So Liverpool has a very sharp kind of north-south divide. So the north up there is the poorer area. Historically was sort of dominated by Irish immigrants, Catholic communities in the past, whereas the south, much leafier, much wealthier. And you can see all those neighbourhood planning areas are in the middle or the north. So these are not wealthy areas. You'll probably have heard of Anfield. That's where Liverpool Football Stadium is. It was an area of housing market renewal that Dave Webb did work on. Really, quite a deprived area, and quite a lot of conflict between local communities and the city council, which I think has partly prompted that plan. And there's also another one which hasn't yet been designated in the L8 area of Toxteth, which you've probably heard of around there. That's where the riots were in Liverpool in the 80s, and then sort of had a mini one a few years ago. So again, deprived areas, not the traditional neighbourhood planning type areas. And just because I was conscious this was very text-based, I just included a couple of pictures. This is Hartley's Village, which I hadn't heard of until recently. So this is often described as Liverpool's Port Sunlight. So Port Sunlight is on the Wirral. It was kind of a classic planning thing. It was a model village built in the end of the 19th century. And this is, to some extent, a Liverpool equivalent. That's the Hartley's Jam Factory. And this was a kind of model village built in front of it, with some really quite nice houses, and the factory itself, which as you can see is derelict. So they've come together. It's now quite a deprived community to start doing their own neighbourhood plan, and in common with the other areas in Liverpool, not traditional neighbourhood plan areas. So what may be happening, to come back to the sort of power question, and this is an entirely speculative conclusion, is that as wealthier areas, more rural areas, are seeing the limitations of neighbourhood planning. So regarding stopping development, as we know, neighbourhood plans have to be pro-development. They can't contain less housing, for instance, than local plan. So as they start to see that, because that's not what they were sold when neighbourhood planning came in, the government said, we're giving you control, get on with it. And I think, certainly from talking to some communities in Cheshire, they're saying, well, what's the point in doing this if we can't stop housing in our here where we don't want it? So some might be falling away. And as poorer, still more urban areas see the potential in neighbourhood planning to actually do something, particularly in the context of, I've used the phrase, hollowed out. So Liverpool City Council, some of the biggest budget cuts in the country, their planning team is now basically a man and his dog. They can't really do very much. And in some parts of the city, they're still in conflict with old HMR areas. So in those kind of areas are some communities starting to come forward and build capacity more slowly than happened in rural areas. They didn't have the pre-existing architecture of parish council, so it's taken them a bit longer, but possibly they are now grasping those opportunities. So just in summary, the initial predictions were that neighbourhood planning would be dominated by wealthier rural areas, and previous trends in terms of engagement suggested that. Early neighbourhood planning evidence probably supported that, and I'm now saying there may be a change underway. And there's just some references, including this paper, just to plug my own work, that we wrote about the Upper Eden neighbourhood plan if you want to find out a bit more about that one. Those are my contributions.
Thank you. I hope we can get back to that very interesting